I would like to welcome our speaker. So in today's session, we are joined by Itay Malka, a cloud solutions architect from 2B Cloud. Itay will walk us through the process of setting up a CI CD pipeline on Kubernetes. This session will run for approximately 60 minutes with time for questions. So Itay, thank you so much for being a part of today's session, and also to 2B Cloud for making this all possible. Please, at this time, you are welcome to unmute yourself, share your screen. I am giving you the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for the introduction. And hi, guys. I want to share my screen. Okay, so hello, you guys, and welcome to the Azure DevOps for AKS webinar. Thanks for coming, first of all. Nice to meet you. My name is Itay Malka. I was born in South Israel, and as you can see, I love sea, music, and especially food, who is not. And I'm also a cloud solutions architect at 2B Cloud. So who is 2B Cloud? So we are a global Microsoft partner. We specialized in working with tech companies and ISVs. We are an Azure expert MSP with advanced specialization in app modernization, SQL migration, and Kubernetes on Azure. And here's the agenda for today. So first of all, I just want you to know that I will save time for Q&A between the following parts and at the end of the meeting. So what are we going to do today? First of all, we're going to make a resources brief. We are going to see how to create basic CI/CD pipelines in Azure DevOps and how to deploy to AKS, which means the Azure Kubernetes Service, using these pipelines. For that, I already created the pipelines, but we will start to build them together from scratch. And for this demo, I also created a simple Node.js web application, which exposed to the internet over port 3000, which means HTTP. And since we need to deploy on Kubernetes, so we will Dockerize the application by creating a Docker file, build the Docker image, and push it to the container registry. In our case, we will use Azure Container Registry to store images inside the repository. And finally, we will see the YAML file which contains the Kubernetes resources and objects like deployment that will run pod with container and external service that will expose our web application to the internet. So first of all, as I said before, I want to start from the resources brief, the AKS and the Azure Container Registry. I go to the browser, and as you can see here, I'm logging to the Azure portal, and I also created before a resource group named Webinar RG. And inside this resource group, we can find two resources. The first one is named Webinar AKS, which represent the AKS cluster, the Kubernetes cluster that we will going to deploy to our web application. And the second one is the container registry named Webinar ACR or Azure Container Registry. So we actually have to create a Docker image and push it to this container registry. And then we want to deploy our application on Kubernetes, which means the AKS. So that's the reason why this resources I created before. Okay, so what's next? GitHub Repository. So we will review all the files inside the repository that I also created before, and push all the files to there, and to understand the whole flow. And now I will show you the repository, but few seconds before, I want to share with you this repo. Is a public repo over the chat. So you can find the link to the repository on the chat. Okay, so as I said before, there is an agenda of what we're going to do today, and I would like to go through all the files inside this repository. So first of all, I would like to talk about the index.js file. I created this file for simple Node.js web application. Since we are not developers and we are a DevOps engineer, so we will not drill down to the code. And it is just starting the web application and write the static content inside it, which means if I click on the file, as you can see, I'm using the Express module in Node.js, and when I will start this web application, it's actually write this static content, welcome to the webinar, on the screen, and another line with the result of 1 + 1 is equal to calc. Calc is a variable that equal to 2. And I want to say that we will see it later, but I actually add this line to the file because I want to test, to run unit tests for the app, and we will talk about it later. Next file is the package JSON. The package JSON is a file that holds the metadata relevant to the project, like modules, dependencies, and etc. in Node.js. Finally, this is the test directory, sorry. And this directory is used to run the unit tests for the app. In many cases, we want to test some of methods in our code. So today I will show a minimal implementation of unit test, and it used to just to understand the concept, the base concept of how to deploy and how to manage our CI CD pipelines in Azure DevOps or in general, any CI CD tool. What's next? So, okay, now we actually understand that we have an application, web application, simple one, the index.js file with the unit test that includes in the test directory. Now, as I mentioned before, we want to deploy our web application to Kubernetes. And if we want to deploy to Kubernetes, it means that we have to Dockerize my application to create a Docker image so I can deploy it on Kubernetes. So for that, I actually created the Docker file. So this Docker file, we must make the application Docker, as I said, and this Docker file can build the Docker image, which expose my web application over port 3000, and we will see how it works later. And what else? Okay, and the last one. So once we have a web application, Docker image, so all what you have to do is to deploy it on Kubernetes. So for that, you can find the YAML file inside the deployment directory. And if I go to it, we can find the webinar app.yaml file that I actually created before. And we can find here two objects, Kubernetes. The first one is a deployment that contains one replica. It means one pod with one container inside it. The name of the container is webinar web app. And the image of the container is actually the image that built from the Docker file that I showed you 1 minute ago. And what is that URL? webinaracr.azurecr.io. So it represents the URL of my container registry. I go back to the Azure portal, and when I go to the container registry, as you can see, the login server, this is the URL that represents my container registry. After that, the slash, this is the repository. If I go to repositories in the left menu, we can find the repository named webinar web app. And inside this repository, I can find the multiple tags for multiple images that I push to this registry. And Okay, so we have deployment. We have one container that can run my web application. But in addition, I want to be able to expose my web application over the internet and over port 3000. So for that, all that I have to do is to create another object, another resource on Kubernetes. And this resource is service type load balancer because I want that this container will be exposed to the internet so anyone can browse to. Okay, so that's about the GitHub repository, and you can right now cloning it to your local computer. Okay, so what's next? Before we'll continue, and after all the theory, I would like to move forward to a local demo, a mini demo on my local computer. And I would like to know if there are any questions, guys, for now, before I will continue. And you can feel free to ask now, and you can feel free to ask me later at the end of the session. Okay, good. Let's check in the text, in the chat, sorry. Okay, it's not a question. Good. Okay, so before I start the local demo, it's really important to say, I just want to show you the concept of CI CD, especially in Azure DevOps, and how to implement it on Azure DevOps. And there are a lot of methods how to do it. And today I will show you one of them. And regarding the local demo, now I will show you how to run the web application local and run the unit test by running the npm commands and node commands because we're using Node.js framework. And so in real cases, before we will start our web application, we would like, or any application, we would like to run some tests to check our code methods. And I will show you the example. And first, we will run the unit tests, and then we will start the web application. So by typing ls-l, as you can see here, I actually already cloned the repository, the GitHub repository, to my local computer. And as you can see here, all the files exist on my computer. And now I want to show you the test, the unit test. So if I cut the test.js file that is located inside the test directory, as we can see here, okay, maybe it's preferred that I will show you it from here, from the GitHub repository, which will be more comfortable. Good. So now, as you can see, I actually ran one simple test. It's called simple math test, which include two tests inside it. The first test, it should return 2 because I want to check what is the result of 1 plus 1. It's supposed to equal to be 2. And the second test should return 9 because 3 times 3 is equal to 9. And it's not really a test in the real life when we are developing a new feature for our application, but it just for this case, it's just for the demo, and I want to show you how it works. So if I go back to the root directory and I want to run the test, I can find how can I run the test in the package JSON file that holds the metadata. So if I'm going here, you can see that there is a section named scripts, and under the scripts, were points to the test that represent the unit tests for our application in Node.js, and the value is Mocha. Mocha is the framework that helps us to run the unit tests in Node.js. So let's see the output and let's see how it works locally on my computer. Let me clean the screen. And now by running the npm run test, I'm getting the following output. Mocha, which is represent the framework of Node.js to get a unit test, and my two tests under the name simple math test. The first one should return 2 is passing successfully, and also they should return 9. 3 times 3 is actually 9. So after I test some methods, for example, yes, in this case, of my code, now I can make sure that I can deploy my application or web application to production, for example, yeah? So I want to start my application by running the command of node with the index.js file, which is the root file. Click enter. And if I'm going to the browser, because I ran and start the web application on my local computer, so I have to browse to my local computer. Localhost over port 3000, which means HTTP, and this is the port that I exposed my web application to the world. Click enter, and as you can see, welcome to the webinar, and the result of 1 + 1 is really equal to 2. We will take and we will change the file, for example. I want to edit the index file. Let add a smile to the file because it's always good to be happy. I save the file. I want to run the web application again. Refresh the page, and here's the smile. And that's exactly what we will going to do with the CI CD pipeline today. And I will show you how easily it to create. So, just a moment. I want to delete and remove the changes. And we are good. Okay. So after the local demo, I want to start with the real process of the session, of this webinar. So we'll talk about two main things. The first one is how to create a build pipeline or CI pipeline in Azure DevOps. And the second one is how to create a release pipeline or CD pipeline in Azure DevOps. And before we'll create the CI pipeline, I think that we need to talk about what is the main purpose of this pipeline. So in the most basic way to define this, the main purpose of the CI pipeline is to build and prepare the application so that it is ready to be deployed on the relevant infrastructure. In our case, Kubernetes. Imagine that we are develop a new feature to our application. Now we want to deploy the new version with this feature. And in addition, in most cases, we would like to add some tests for our application before we'll deploy it on the production environment, for example, or any environment, even if it's testing environment, development environment, and etc. So we will create the build pipeline, which includes the following components. Sorry. Okay. So we will, as I said, we'll create the pipeline with the following components.
Itay?
Yes.
We're still seeing the PowerPoint.
Sorry?
We're still seeing the PowerPoint slide.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
It's okay. Thanks. I just want to say some theory before we're going to the Azure DevOps. So with the following components, the first one is the trigger, the pipeline from any push or pull request to the main branch in our repository. So just to imagine it again, once we committed and pushed the new feature to the repository, we want to be able to be ready for newer version of our application. So this is the first one, and I will show you everything, don't worry. The second one is another task or another part in CI pipeline is to print variables. In our pipeline and in most of the pipelines all over the world, we are using several variables that are used by us for one or more pipelines. For example, what is the application version, where is the path to the specific files, and etc. Another part or another component is, in our case, is to install the npm package and run the npm test, which means the unit test. Since we are using Node.js in this case, we need to install the relevant modules from the package JSON by running the npm install command, and then run the unit test by running the npm run test commands. Next, we're going to build the Docker file and push it to the ACR, to the Azure Container Registry, because we have to deploy it on Kubernetes using the Docker image. And the last component and the last step of any CI pipeline, in most cases, is to publish an artifact. So the last step, as I say, to publish an artifact that we would like to use in the CD pipeline, which means this is the relevant files to be deployed on the infrastructure. So in this case, we will publish the deployment YAML file because we want to deploy this YAML file on Kubernetes to create all the relevant resources. So now, all the parts that you are guys waiting for, now we will going to the Azure DevOps. So, okay, so in Azure DevOps, there is a hierarchy. For example, if you can see my cursor, you can see that I already created an organization in Azure DevOps named Itay 0480. And under the organization, I can create a project. I also created project named Webinar Project. I can create multiple projects under one organization. And this is, in a high level, the let's say, the hierarchy of the Azure DevOps. So Azure DevOps had a lot of features that you can use, starting from boards to manage we can use it as platform to manage all of our tasks. For example, like Jira, repos. This is the source code management. Like GitHub, we can store and include all of our code here in Azure DevOps directly. Pipelines, we are going to talk and use a lot about with pipelines, with CI pipelines, which means the build pipeline, and the releases pipelines, which means the CD pipeline. Test plans and artifact, there are another feature, but it's not really necessary to this webinar, so I will not talk about it. So, okay, so now we are in Azure DevOps. By clicking on pipeline, I get this page. And now I would like to start from scratch. I want to build to create a new build pipeline. So by creating here on new pipeline in the top right corner of the page, now I will need to configure some things. First of all, is where is my code? What is my source code management? And in this example, my source code management is actually in GitHub. So I will choose GitHub. Okay. Next, select repository. I will choose the webinar repo. This is the repository that I created for this webinar. And one thing that we have to understand that we must link our repo to the pipeline, because we will use the files inside the repository, and we want that the pipeline will be triggered for any push or pull request to the main branch or any branch of our repository. So it's really important to understand why we're linking our source code management to the build pipeline. Next. What's next? So configure your pipeline. So Azure DevOps is very convenient to use because there are a lot of building templates which may help us easily to create our pipeline. We will start with an empty pipeline and build the pipeline from scratch in this case. So I will scroll down and click on Starter Pipeline. So now, as you can see, once I chose the Starter Pipeline, it automatically created a YAML file in my repository named Azure-pipelines-1.yaml. So from one side, you have to be familiar with YAML syntax, but from the other side, you will see how easily you can create your pipeline with built-in tasks list in the next few seconds when I go to the pipeline that I actually created before. So now we can see that we can start to write our pipeline, and there are a lot of methods and combination of how to create a pipeline. There is a hierarchy in Azure DevOps for the pipeline structure. Yes, for example, some stages which include multiple jobs, and jobs which include multiple steps, and steps which include multiple tasks. And I will show you how it works in the next few seconds, and you can treat each of them in the way that is the best for your organization. In this case, I will show how I chose to implement the basic CI pipeline, and it is not necessarily the best way that I want you to do. I want you to know, sorry. And okay, so before I will explain for any line or command like the trigger main, like the pull, I want to show you the hierarchy of the structure of the Azure DevOps pipeline, CI pipeline, and I want to show you what I'm talking about. So, for example, I want to start to build my pipeline by this hierarchy. So, first of all, let's, as I say, stages. For example, this is the top level in this hierarchy. Under stages, I can create my stage, for example, my stage. Under the stage, I can create multiple jobs, and job, this is my job, for example. And under the jobs, I can create multiple tasks, steps, and task. So this is a basic YAML syntax for how to create CI pipeline in Azure. And now, if I want to create a task, for example, I want to run any bash script or something like that, I can just write bash, and with an amazing autocomplete of Azure, by click enter, I can to configure this task. And as you can see here, it also created a settings button for me. So if I'll click on the settings button, then I can work with a confident UI. So by clicking on inline, I just, for example, want to, I don't know, echo two sentences to the user. So I can hello webinar people and hello world, for example. By clicking on add, of course, that I can configure a lot of another settings here, and I can execute any script from any path that placed and located in my repository. But in this case, I just want to show you a simple bash script. So by clicking on add, as you can see, that it was really simple to create bash script with all of the parameters and settings to be configured. And as you can see here in the right menu, there are the built-in tasks in Azure DevOps. For example, let's say that I want another task I don't know, I want to publish my artifact, for example. So I can search for publish artifact, and perfect. By clicking on publish an artifact, you can see that easily I can configure what is the path to publish and what is the artifact name and all the parameters that is necessary to be configured to define this task. Clicking on add, and here is another task. So the UI is really familiar to the user, and that's it. So all what I want to show you here, the hierarchy of the structure of Azure DevOps CI pipeline, and it's really important to understand it. The stages, and under the stages, the jobs and the steps and the tasks. And I can, for example, I don't know, divide my stages by, let's say, by environments. For example, I want to execute some jobs for my testing environment. Then I would like to create another stage, for example, and this stage is represent my development environment. And I can maybe implement some conditions. For example, if the testing stage was failed, for example, I don't know, don't execute the development stage. And this is really important and really necessary in a DevOps engineer life. So now I want to show you and to work about the pipeline, the CI pipeline that I created before. So by clicking on it, I will click on edit. Sorry. Okay, so what we can see here in this pipeline. Let's talk about all of the commands. The first command here, trigger main. This is the first line. It means that this pipeline will be triggered whenever any push or pull request will happen to the main branch. I can change the name of instead of main to the relevant branch, for example. Next, as we can see here, we see the section of variables. This is the way to define variables in a CI pipeline in Azure. This way, I can use these variables along the entire length of the pipeline and even pass them to another pipelines. And that's a really cool feature and really cool option to use in Azure DevOps. For example, I can, as you can see here, I also created variable named Docker Registry Service Connection. And this name, this value, is represent the service connection that allows me to push Docker images to the Azure Container Registry. I will, in the next few minutes, I will talk about the service connection because it is a really important object in Azure DevOps, because that's the way how we can grant the permissions on Azure services or Azure resources or external services that are not included in the Azure DevOps. Image repository for the name of the repository inside the container registry, what is the URL of the container registry, what is the Docker file path, for example. As you can see here, I actually use built-in environment variable. This environment variable is a built-in in Azure DevOps, and it represents my the path that I'm working on while the pipeline is executed. So this variable will point to the path of the Docker file, and this is the directory, which means the root directory of my repository if you remember, I linked my repository with this CI pipeline. So I actually use this path / Dockerfile. So if you go back to the repository, we can find here in the root directory the Docker file in the root directory. So this is why we're using the / Dockerfile. Another important variable is the tag. Actually, here the value is a built-in variable. For any execution of CI pipeline or build pipeline, there is a unique identifier which called build ID. So I want to use this tag later when I will push the Docker image to the container registry. As you can see here, all of the numbers. So these numbers represent the build ID of the pipeline, of the CI pipeline they comes from. Okay, and the last name, VM image name, I will talk about it later. This is the operating system of my agent. So, what else? Okay, so here we can see, So here we can see that we are starting, as I said before, with the hierarchy in the stages line. And in this case, I treated the stage as an environment. For example, multiple stages for multiple environment, testing, dev, production, as I said before. And there are really several approaches regarding how to treat it. You can choose your own prefer, and whatever you want, it's okay. So in this case, I really represent it as my environment. For example, testing. Display name, this is the name this is the name of the CI pipeline that I will see when I watch the logs while the CI pipeline runs. So this is just represent the name. It's not really matter. Next, this is the jobs. So here I'm going to define all my tasks, all my actually jobs that I want that this CI pipeline will make. So first of all, as I mentioned before, the first job is print parameters or print variables. And why is that? Because I want just to verify and validate all of my parameters or all of my variables that I define in the app of this pipeline. And I can view later on the pipeline executions history. So it's really helpful. And if we're going next to the pool section, now Azure DevOps allocates for us an agent. An agent, it means a machine or server on which all of the following commands will run. So once I mention the pool, I can choose which agent I want that Azure DevOps will allocate for me. So in this case, I chose to use Ubuntu latest because to run all of the following commands, I need to use a Linux operating system. So now we see the print parameters job that I defined, but I want to, now I have to append a tasks for that to be executed. So as you can see here, this is a simple bash task that all what it does, it actually print all of the variables above. The first one is the service connection, the second image repository, and so on and so on. And again, why should I need it? Because it's really a classic CI pipeline. In this case, we have really not a lot of variables, but in really pipeline, in a big organization, we can find more than 100 variables. So if we want to research the pipeline and view the history, so I can go back to the run to the runtime of the CI pipeline and just view all of these parameters. So that's the reason why this job or this task is really simple, but it's really important and helpful to research the next issues of our application. So next job is to run the application tests. If you remember, and as I show you in the local demo, before we build our application and before we want to deploy our application, we want to check and test some methods in our code. So the application tests is to install the node modules from the package.json file and then run the unit tests. So if you can see, before I go into the tasks, there are again display name and the display on parameter. Depends on parameter, and depends on parameter represent that, and it says until the print parameters didn't finish, you will not start. And it's really important because sometimes we want to make things in order. We want to execute the first task and then the second task and then the third task, and not in parallel. So that's the reason why I append this parameter here. And there are a lot of features in Azure DevOps, but really it's the basics. So as I said before, we want to run the npm install command, which is also a built-in task in Azure DevOps. And you can see here, I want to find npm. By clicking on npm, I can add this task as well. And okay, and once I run npm install, the command npm install is required any package.json file, because it must know which modules and which dependencies should I install. So that's the reason why you can find here the working directory. So my working directory, it means where is the package.json file exists and where is it located. So this package.json file is actually works in the root directory. And as you remember before, this is how can I a built-in environment variable that helps me to locate the root directory. Next, npm. After I run the npm install to install all the relevant modules for the tests, now I can run the command of npm custom command. Not this is just a custom command. Npm run test, because I want to run my test. So once this task will be done, I'm expecting to get the output of, this output of the testing. Simple math test that 2 tests are passing successfully. And next job is maybe the most important job in the CI pipeline. In many cases, I can say in any CI pipeline. And why? Because in this job, build and push, is actually to build the Docker image from the Docker file and push it to the Azure Container Registry. And this job and these tasks will build my application. So we have to be very carefully about it, and we have to take it really, really seriously, as the other jobs here, but especially this job. And what can we see here? So we can see 2 steps, which means 2 tasks. The first one is the command of, it's one task, building task in Azure DevOps that includes 2 tasks actually. The first one is the Docker build that will build the Docker image from the Docker file. And the second one is the Docker push, because I want to push my image with a specific tag to the container registry. So what's the parameter that I have, or the setting that I have to set here in this task? Let's think about it. So build and push, this is a built-in command that represents the build task and the push task. Repository, why it's important? Because, and now you can see that I use my variable from the start of the pipeline, image repository, and if I go scroll up, I can see that image repository represents the name of my image of my repository in the container registry. So repository, which means that what is the name of the image repository? The Docker file, what is the path to the Docker file? Exactly as the last setting, the last parameter, the repository. Actually here, I also use the variable from the start of the pipeline. What's next? Container registry. So now there is an interesting question. I want to specify my container registry. So this is my container registry. But how Azure DevOps have the permissions to push any Docker image to my private container registry on Azure? So for that, we will answer in the next few minutes, because I want to talk about it separately. And it's really important thing. And the last parameter is the tags. So which means I want to, before I want to push the Docker image to the container registry, I want to specify what is the tag. And the tag specify what is the version of my application. So I chose to tag my Docker image with two tags actually. The first one is the environment variable named tag, which represents the build ID of the CI pipeline. And the second one is the latest. And why I did it? Because I want that no matter who is the latest, who is the last image that pushed to the container registry, it must be the latest image. So it actually holds the latest version of my web application. So that's the reason. And I just wanted to show you that you can configure more than one tag and more than and you can do it multiple times. So this is the task of the Docker build and push. What's next? Publish artifact. As I mentioned before, any CI/build pipeline finished with publish artifact task or step. And why? Because this artifact will be used in the CD pipeline, and the publish artifact is to publish the deployment file for the CD pipeline, as I said, to be deployed on AKS. So if you understand, we want to publish the YAML file, which includes the Kubernetes objects or resources. So what is the parameters here? Path to publish, which means the root directory /deployment. Why /deployment? Because if I go back to the repository, click on deployment directory, here I can find the webinar app YAML, which represent my the objects of Kubernetes that should be deployed on. And the artifact name, we just named our artifact in specific name, and publish location container, not really necessary. So how do Azure DevOps, and this is the really, important thing in Azure DevOps, get permissions on the resources in my Azure environment, in my private Azure environment. So I can configure it here by clicking on project settings and scroll down to service connections, sorry. Now can I define all of the connections to my external resources. So what is a service connection? This is an object in Azure DevOps that enable to connect to external and remote services to execute tasks in a specific job, that which exactly what we are need to do. And as we can see here, I actually have 3 service connections. The first one is GitHub. And why? Because we linked our GitHub repository to the pipeline, and the pipeline need permission to pull the code from the GitHub repository, from the from the GitHub repository. Next, we can see here the webinar ACR connection, which represent the permission to the Azure Container Registry. And the last one is we want to be able to that Azure DevOps CD pipeline we will be able to deploy on the Kubernetes, on the AKS cluster. So we actually have to create a service connection. How we can create service connection? When we click on new service connection here, we have multiple, how can I say that, endpoints or options to create the service connection on which or for specific resource. But for example, in my case, or in our case, I want to allow this Azure DevOps to get permissions to my Azure resources. So I will check the Azure Resource Manager, and I have multiple options how I want to grant the permissions. There is another way to do it. If I'll go through the CI pipeline, and let's check, for example, the task of the build and push Docker. So now, wait a minute, not this one. Where should I have to use the service connection? Okay. Okay, so let's do it here. Build and push. For example, if I want to create a new task, now it will ask me to, container registry service connection. And if I want to create a service connection, I can do it. I will show you what is the second option in the CD pipeline, because there is a more comfortable GUI to do it. Okay, so that's the step of the CI pipeline, guys. I would like to know if there are any questions, or if you want to wait until all of the process and all of the whole process with the CI and CD pipelines will be shown to you. And at the end of the session, of course, that I will show you how all of this flow actually works. So don't worry about it. But I would like to know if for now there are any questions, quick questions.
I think we have a few questions here in the chat window.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, good. We have a question from Muhammad. He's asking, why is there a tick in line 36?
Line 36. Sorry. Thanks, Ilanit. Edit. .36. What is the question?
Why is there tick in line 36?
Tick in line 36.
Yeah, you have a back tick there just before image.
Before
This
image,
one?
yeah.
Ah, okay. So yeah. So thanks for the attention. It's wrong syntax. It's not really necessary here. Thanks for the attention. Any other questions, Ilanit, or we will wait until the end of the.
Let's do another question. I see Kevin has a question, then we continue. Kevin, you can take yourself out of mute.
Sure, thank you. Just a quick question about using environments with deploying Kubernetes images, or what has been your experience deploying into environments with Kubernetes and containers?
Sorry, I didn't hear you as well. I don't know if it's me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now or no?
Yes. Can I hear you?
Okay. Just a quick question about using environments with Kubernetes deployments.
Okay.
Adding those into your pipelines. Have you had good experience using those? Is it something you haven't adopted yet, or just trying to find out more about integrating environments into that pipeline?
Okay, so that's a good question. Thanks, Kevin. I would like to talk about the importance of different environment in Kubernetes when we are deploying to Kubernetes, especially in the CD pipeline, because here in the CI pipeline, there is a really meaning for the environment. As if I want to, for example, use multiple stages for multiple environments, but actually the differences between the environment tasks in the CI pipeline, there is no so much differences as we can find the differences in the real life in the CD pipelines. And I would like to talk about it in the next step, but thanks for the question. Okay.
Let's go ahead. Let's go ahead for CD.
Yes. So CD. Okay. So CD, CI, continuous integration. CD, continuous deployment or continuous delivery. And before we will create the CD/release pipeline, so I think that we should understand what is the main purpose of this pipeline also. So CD is about the processes that have to happen after code is integrated for app changes to be delivered to users. Or in simple words, this is the pipeline which is responsible for deployed our code on the infrastructure after all the code tests and validations, which means the, which means the tests and validations represent the CI pipeline. So in this case, we will see how it works and which tasks can we will use to deploy. We'll use to deploy the web application on AKS cluster. So we'll create a release pipeline which includes the following components, and I will show you that. To get the CD pipeline, I go into the releases here. And I also created a pipeline, but I would like to start from scratch as we did for the CI pipeline, and then I will talk about the pipeline and this pipeline. So how can I create a new release pipeline? By clicking on Renew, New Release Pipeline. And here, I would like to start from scratch, as I said. Again, even on the CD, also on the CD pipeline, the release pipelines, you can find a lot of built-in features and a lot of built-in tasks to deploy without any code to a specific infrastructure, especially on Azure, but also outside Azure. I will start with an empty job here. Okay, and let me call this stage deploy to AKS, not QA webinar test, for example. And now, once I clicked on release, new release pipeline, and I can change the name to my release pipeline, we can see here two components. The left one is the artifacts. And this is very important to understand because, as I mentioned before, we must do the CI and the CD words are always, not always, but in the most cases, it comes together. And what is the connection between the CI and the CD? This is the artifact. The last step in the CI pipeline was to publish any artifact. And the first step in the CD pipeline is to take this artifact from the CI pipeline. So this is the left component which called artifacts. What is the right component named stages? As we know from the CI pipelines, stages is stages. I can create multiple stages and I can define here multiple variables. So all what I want to do now is I want to start with the artifact. I want to show you how can I configure and pull the artifact that I also push and published in the CI pipeline. By clicking on add an artifact, I will choose the build source type because I want to take it from any build pipeline. Next, I want to choose my build pipeline and under my project. Default version for now, it will be latest. We can specify which version of the artifact we would like to take. In this case, and this is really important to us, I would like to use the latest. And the source alias is just an alias that created and represent my artifact from the build pipeline. But as you can see here in my cursor, this line actually say that I have an artifact from this build pipeline named webinar artifact. And if you remember as well, I actually named the published artifact in the CI pipeline. I named it as webinar artifact. So that's good. And by clicking on add, I can add my artifact to my CD pipeline. Now, next question that we can ask ourselves is okay, now whenever any CI pipeline executed, I would like that the CD pipeline will automatically start to execute. So how can I do it? Easily. I can click on the continuous deployment trigger, and by enable the continuous deployment trigger here, all what I say that anytime that there is a new artifact that created, trigger the related stages, trigger the CD pipeline. And now I'm good because I actually have an artifact. And now the question is what I wanted to do with this artifact. So by clicking on the job and tasks here, now I can starting to work on the CD pipeline. So, okay, where is my mouse? Sorry. Okay, so here you can see and you can find as the first job is the agent job. And this agent job represent the same, is the same as the pull parameter in the CI pipeline. As I said before, Azure DevOps allocates for us an agent, a machine, a server that all the commands will run on. So now we can define one agent, we can define multiple agents, and we can define our server from Azure, for example, and not just any random agent from Azure DevOps. That I can, all what I'm interested in is the agent specification, which represent which operating system I want that this agent will host. So Windows Server is fine for me because I don't need any more Linux for the CD pipeline, and let's think why. So here, as you can see, we have again a lot of built-in tasks, and this is not CI pipeline. This is a CD pipeline. So in this release pipeline, I would like to perform tasks that can help me to deploy my artifact on my infrastructure. So in this case, let's say that I would like to take the artifact with the deployment YAML file and deploy it on my Kubernetes cluster. So how can I deploy on Kubernetes? I have two mainly options, okay? The first one is to use the kubectl command, the client of Kubernetes. So if I want to use kubectl, first I have to install kubectl on the agent. So I can add this task and install kubectl with a specific version or with the latest version, not really matter for now. Next, once I have kubectl on my computer or in this agent, I would like to take the file, the YAML file, and deploy using kubectl, for example. So again, I will search for kubectl command by clicking on add. Now, as you can see here, some settings need attention. And of course, some settings need attention because kubectl, there are a lot of flags that I can execute with this command. For example, kubectl apply, kubectl create, get, set, login, and so on. And let's take it as I said before that there is another option to create a service connection to grant a permission. Sorry?
А, ты пойдешь сейчас? Нет, на холодно.
Guys, please mute yourself.
Thanks. And now, as I said before, the second option to create a service connection is from here, from the GUI. Actually, here, the Azure DevOps, this task asked me, okay, give me permissions to deploy on Kubernetes. Currently, I have no permissions and I don't know your cluster. So all that I have to do is to choose any service connection if I already created. And if not, I can click on new. And here there are three options. For example, in this task, in kubectl, Kubernetes task, that I can create a service connection. The first one is to use the kubeconfig file that represent all my credentials here, and then I can get permissions to deploy on my AKS cluster. This is first option. Service account, this is another option that is not really relevant, and we'll use this option in the most of the cases. And the last option and the easiest option is to use the Azure Subscription. Currently now is loading subscriptions, and because it takes my user and loading all of the subscription that I have permissions, and then I can easily choose the subscription, choose the resource groups in the resource group in Azure, and then I can choose the cluster. And when I will choose the cluster, it will ask me, okay, now you choose the cluster, choose please which namespace would you like that I will deploy to. For example, in my case, I have 2B Cloud. This is my subscription. Cluster webinar AKS. In the webinar RGs, this is the resource group. And now, namespace. Okay, this is the namespace that you actually have in your cluster. Which one of them? So it must to know that even if I will choose the default namespace, I will not be able to deploy on other namespace. So it's really important to know, and that's it. So next, what else? So as I said before, I can deploy on Kubernetes using the kubectl, and I can deploy on Kubernetes, for example, using Helm charts. For example, again, in the case of the kubectl, I had to install the kubectl on the agent. So here again, I had to install Helm with a specific version. As you can see here, can specify the version. And what's next? I can Helm chart, can deploy my and run Helm commands that deploy my Helm chart on Kubernetes. So if I go back to the kubectl, now you can understand that if you want to how can I say that? If you want to deploy to Kubernetes, so I must to choose the namespace, for example, default. Put in attention, please. Pay attention that the namespace here must to be the same namespace as we defined in the service connection. Next, which command would we like to use? kubectl create, kubectl apply, kubectl, for in this case, kubectl apply. And what would we like to do? Oh, now we have the deployment YAML file that we published as an artifact. So I can check the use configuration, and here it will ask me for what is the file path to the YAML file, or what is the inline. For example, here I can define that a YAML file, API version v1, what is the kind, for example, pod and metadata, and so on and so on and so on. But I don't have to create it from scratch. So I already published an artifact from the CI pipeline. So by click on the browse file path, I can see the linked artifacts. I actually view this build pipeline. And this is the name of my artifact, if you remember, webinar artifact. And then finally, I find my webinar app.yaml file. So by clicking on OK, all what that this task will execute is to run the command kubectl apply. I can append the flag -f or --force, for example, to override the changes in Kubernetes. And what it will be deployed? The YAML file. So I'm happy. And now, after we talked about it, I would like to show you the pipeline that I created before. And then I will show you how all the workflow actually works. Okay. So here I added the artifact. And here I have one job with 4 tasks. And I didn't forget you, Kevin. I will answer the environment question after that. So what's next? As you can see here, I actually have 4 tasks, and I will explain. The first one is just a bash script, simple bash script that print environment variable, where I can define environment variable here in the variables section. So all what I did, I actually defined and initiate environment variable named image tag. And the value of this environment variable is the build ID that comes from the CI pipeline. And why I'm using it in the CD pipeline? This is a good question. But I'm using it because I need to know what is the version of my app. Because if you remember, I tagged my Docker image with the build ID. So I need that the CD pipeline will know this build ID, this actually image tag, which represents the version of my web application. And then I know which version I have to deploy on my cluster. So, okay, so the first is just simple bash to echo and print the image tag. And why? Because I just want to see that I actually going to deploy the right version. Next, I want to install the kubectl latest version. Next, I want to deploy my YAML file. So that's exactly what I did here. I actually deployed the YAML file. That's what this task is performed. And the last command is the kubectl set. So all of you guys who are familiar with Kubernetes and especially with kubectl client, so it will be very easy to understand. So kubectl set command, I use it to change the current deployment image to the last build ID. And I remember tag or build ID is equal to version. And in my case, why kubectl is really necessary, because I'm always deploying the same YAML file with the same image reference, latest tag. If I'm going to back to the repository, and you can see here, this is a static string. It always will be deployed using the latest. There is a method how to change it, but in this case, in really this simple and basic case, I use a static string. So if I will continue, if I will try to deploy the same YAML file, again, no changes will be made because I did not change any value of the Kubernetes resources. So if we were using Helm charts, so you're right, it would solve the problem since there is a very easy way to deal with this issue. For example, -- reset values. Who is familiar with Helm charts know this command. But in this case, I'm using kubectl, so I have to deal with this situation. So now I would like to show you how it works after we go through all the CI and CD pipelines, and not only theory, and we will follow the logs and watch the logs online, and I will show you the Kubernetes pods, deployment, and services. So before I will do it, I just want to show you something. I'll go back to the terminal. I actually connected and logged in to the AKS cluster that I showed you on Azure. So by running let me clean the screen, by running the kubectl get pods, now as you can see, I actually have one pod in a running state. What else? I actually deployed a deployment. So this deployment actually holds this pod. So the deployment is here as expected as well. And I want that this web application will be exposed to the internet over pod 3000. So kubectl get service. And here is my service. Here is the external IP, sorry. And if I'll go to the browser and put this public IP, and as you can see, here is my web application. However, we have to remember why I didn't mention here the 3000 port, because it's some about Kubernetes, some words about Kubernetes. The service which exposed which will be exposed the container to the internet, get all the traffic over port HTTP, which is the default HTTP port. So we don't have to say that or to initiate it, and it will get all the traffic over port 80 and move the traffic to the port over port 3000. So that's the reason why I can access this public IP just by paste it in the browser and click enter. And now to the interesting, let's say, part in this webinar. So now I would like to make some changes, push them to the repository, and then I would like to know and figure out what will happen. So let's say that I want to change my index.js file. I want to change my application. So I will edit the index.js file. Welcome to webinar. Create people, and thanks for taking part in this video. Dot. Now I will save. Now I actually develop a new feature. And it's not really a feature, but I changed the static content of my web application. Now I want to push all the changes to my GitHub repository, commit and push. So git status, okay, modified. Git add, git commit, update, index.js, and git push. It seems like it's done. Let's go to the repository. Let's go to the root directory. Click on index.js. Okay. Welcome to webinar, great people, and thanks for taking part in this video. Great. Now I want to go to the Azure DevOps, click on pipelines, CI pipeline, and we can see that actually it automatically executed. Why? Because if you remember, I have the trigger from the main branch for any push or pull request. So by clicking on the specific execution, I can see the logs. And before I will see the logs, you can see here the name of the jobs, print parameters, npm install, npm test, build. So that's the reason why I told you that I can view the history of any execution of this pipeline. So print parameters, I'll click on bash because I want to see the bash output, and print all parameters, service connection, here is the output, image repository, here is the output, build ID, this is the most important, this is our newer version of the application, 33. And if we will go online to see here, I actually have not yet the 33 number here. So I know that the image has not been pushed to the repository yet with this image tag. So next is the npm. So npm install. So okay, it's installed all the relevant packages. That looks good. And what's next? Good. npm test, run test. So if you remember the output of the unit test, simple math test, this is exactly was my output in my local computer. So I'm good, and now I can go to build my Docker file to be a Docker image and push to the container registry. But let's see and follow the, we can see the output. Now it will start from the from step 1 in the Docker file, and then until the end of the Docker file. Okay, so it seems like it pushed. As you can see here, the output pushed. If I go to the to my container registry, click on refresh, and ta-dam! I actually can see here the 33 image tag. Okay, so now what? By run the kubectl get pods, I can run the command kubectl describe pod, and I want to see what is the image. So I will grab only the image, and actually the current version is 32. You can see the image of the pod. I'll go back to the releases because, as we said, for any published artifact, there is automatically triggered for the CD pipeline. And we can see that in this time, here is a new release, 17 in this number, and it's actually in progress. By clicking on it, can see all the outputs. So let's move through the outputs. The first, initialize job. This is the step that Azure DevOps allocates us the agent. Next, download artifact, because the CD pipeline needs to pull all of the files, in this case only one file, YAML file, from the CI pipeline, so it calls download artifact. Second, print image tag. We want to see that we are using the right version, so 33. That's good. What's next? install kubectl. Just because I know kubectl, I know that it actually passed successfully. Kubectl apply, kubectl set, and finalize job. So if I go now, kubectl get pods, I actually still see here only one pod. But as you can see, the last pod was running for more than 30 hours. And this new pod is running only 44 seconds. So if I will run the command again of kubectl describe pod with this pod ID or name, grep only the image. Sorry, why did I wrong? Describe. As you can see, guys, now we actually have the newer version, which represents the 33. And all of that started only from my git push command. I committed the changes, I pushed the changes, and from there, everything happened automatically. So thank you guys. Thank you so much for the listening. And now I'm here, and I would like to know if you have any question for anything. Feel free to write in the Q&A chat, and feel free to open your microphone and one by one and ask me. And again, thanks so much.
Any questions, guys?
I will go to the Teams. Opa, sorry.
Feel free to unmute as well and ask any questions if you.
Can you explain what are the versions? Okay, I can see here a question. Can you explain what are the various metrics that can be monitored in AKS deployments? So yes, this question is actually more relevant to drill down in hardcore Kubernetes and not a specialist for AKS. But let me, you know what? Let me go to the to my AKS cluster. Maybe it can help you by clicking on metrics, and it's only here from the portal. So there are a lot of metrics that I can expose and a lot of methods that I can monitor my AKS cluster, maybe even if it's an Azure portal or even if it's in a third-party tools like Prometheus and like Elasticsearch and like other data tools that can help me monitor, and Datadog to monitor my nodes and my cluster and my pods. And you know, all of that tools is actually related to the to the HPA, the horizontal pod autoscaler. We can link it easily. So once we want to monitor our deployment, is to understand why, or what, not why, but when do I need to scale up my pod, or to scale up the pods, or even if when I need to scale up my nodes. And regarding your questions, cluster autoscaler, no, I can. Regarding the deployments, okay, so there is no any built-in metric for deployments in Azure, but again, if you will use a third-party tool for monitoring, you can get, I think, almost any metric that you want, even if it's custom metric.
Another question, is there any way to configure email addresses to send email for CI CD status that is build or deployed, failed, or succeed?
Very good question. So the answer is absolutely yes. If I'm going to the CD, so I can just a moment, maybe my mail is actually closed, but for any failed pipeline, even CI pipeline, we will get an email, and we can define all of the settings, not define, and put all of the emails and only the administrator email of the organization or something like that. We can define any email that we want in the project under the project settings here. But I want to show you another thing that it's maybe will be relevant to your questions, that let's say that I would like to add another stage. Okay, so let's call it and let's change it. I would like to deploy to AKS cluster. This is my QA environment, for example. And here I would like to deploy to AKS cluster, but this is my production environment, for example. Until the deployment to the QA environment didn't happen, so I don't want that it will be deployed on the production. And I have a really good feature, pre-deployment condition. It's one of them. I can define here pre-deployment approval that I can insert my name, for example, Itay Malka at 2bcloud.io, and for anytime that this QA stage will be done, so there is not automatically deployed to the production, only when I will approve over the mail the deployment, and I can append here and add multiple, for example, Ilanit and so on. Yes, so for your question is actually it's possible. Can we deploy to other third-party cloud servers using Azure DevOps pipeline? Yes, we can. We can use the external services. This question is to be is supposed to be asked with a specific third resource or name or whatever infrastructure that you want to deploy on, because not all of them you can deploy, but you can deploy to external services.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Itay. Hope you guys enjoyed.
That's it?
Thank you all.
That's it.
That's it.
Thank you all. If you are sticking around, if you stuck through to the very end, we dropped a lot of information into the chat. Lots of great links, resources, a survey, some feedback. We'd love to have 2bcloud back again for another session. For those of you that responded to the poll, we'll take that into account, and hopefully we'll have something up on the calendar soon enough. We'd love to have them back. Thank you, Itay and Ilanit, for helping out and your contributions for today's Reactor session. This was really great. Had a wonderful turnout, lots of chat interaction and everything as well. If you are not familiar with the Microsoft Reactor program, we are on Meetup. We have our own website, microsoftreactor.com. Feel free to check that out. We have lots of content always coming up. We're located in 11 physical spaces around the world. So, you know, depending on your time zone, there may be a session for everyone that's joining. So do check that out. We're also on Twitter, and we have a monthly email mailing list that we send around just with highlights for the following month's like events and sessions and things. So aka.ms/reactor email sign up. So do feel free to do that as well if you'd like to see more content that the Reactor is putting out. All right. Thank you all. Again, everyone have a
Thanks,
great
Rebecca.
rest.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Rebecca.
you.
Much.
Take care all.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks.